Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in us the fire of your love. Well, I've talked a lot through the years about my experience in both Curcio and Kairos Outside. Curcio is a Christian renewal movement. They put on a weekend experience for people to deepen their relationship with God. And Kairos Outside is for women who have loved ones who are incarcerated. And I've also done a couple Via de Cristo weekends, which is in the Lutheran Church. But the point of all these weekends is I really learned something about servanthood. And, you know, the people that come are the guests, and they come, and the teams have been preparing for 6 to 8 weeks before they ever get there to create a Christian community to invite them into. And it's all about servanthood, and servanthood with great love. I mean, I've never had such joy as when I've worked these teams. And even though you're working hard and the hours are long and you're doing everything you can to make sure others have a great weekend, there's a lot of joy in it. A lot of joy in being a servant. And so when Jesus talks to these sons of Zebedee, who are a little bit of dense, I think, at times, he reminds them that if they want to be first, they have to be last. They have to be willing to be a servant of others. And, you know, besides the different renewal movements and Christian communities I've been a part of, my parents, you know, any of you that are parents, you know something about servanthood. Have you ever had your kids just spontaneously say thank you, you know, for what you did for them? I mean, as they get to a certain age, maybe if you have kids that are beyond 25, you've probably heard this by now. But when they're little, they just expect it. They expect to be fed, and they expect to have clean clothes, and they expect food to be in the refrigerator, and, you know, and a roof over their head. I mean, they just do. You know, and so I think I learned a lot about servanthood from my parents, because they had wanted a family. They had wanted a few kids. They had both been only children, and so we were very wanted. And they enjoyed, I think, most of the time, our family life, but they were very surprised at the sibling rivalry, which is a little bit of what the disciples are displaying here. You know, there's this one-upmanship. It's like, who can be at the top of the heap? You know, who's going to get most recognized? You know, my younger sister, we used to always say, she always kept score. Well, you did this for so-and-so. And my parents, God love them, you know, if one kid got a trip with somebody, then somebody else got a trip with somebody else. And it was like they did so much to try to keep things even. And I think, how does God, on the grander scale, you know, balance this all out, you know? And it's like, the good thing is God's kingdom isn't built like the world's. We can't balance everything out perfectly. But God has a way of raising people up that are low, or taking a low position if they are serving others. In God's kingdom, that's high status. You know, what did Jesus do? First, he comes and he's a baby, and he comes into this world helpless, dependent on his parents to care for him and raise him. And then as he went into ministry, he didn't have a home. He ran around with this ragtag band of fishermen and tax collectors, spreading the good news that others might greater know God. But then he said these things that people just didn't get. Like, you know, last week we had the rich man, and he tells them to sell everything he has and give it to the poor. This week, he's saying, if you want to be great, first you have to be a servant. And I'll tell you, I really did experience great joy when I worked any team serving others. But it was short term. You know, you could be your best self for a weekend or even for 8 weeks while you were building the community. But in the day-to-day grind of that, it's hard. You know, like sometimes when I'm on my way home, you know, on that Randall Road and somebody's trying to break in, sometimes I let them out and say, after you, Jesus, and sometimes I think, I want to make that light up there and I don't want to stop. It's hard because I think we're selfish. Unfortunately, as much goodness and love as are in us, there's also a fair amount of selfishness. And we have to deal with that in the best way we can and be willing to turn our self-will over to God and say, as Jesus did, not my will, but yours be done. Another great example I learned of servanthood was through the years. I started out as a special ed teacher with physically disabled kids. I spent years working at camp while I was in college, working with kids with physical disabilities. Then later I coordinated respite care for a social service agency and really got to get inside with families and talk to the parents and see what they were dealing with. You know, when you have a kid, you're a servant. When you have a kid with a disability, take that to the nth degree. I always tell people, you know, parenthood is permanent. But when you have a kid with a disability, it's terminal. Because until you die, you will be worried about what happens with that kid. And I think parents in general are concerned about their kids, but once you get them launched, you feel a little better, you know, and you're not that same kind of... If I have a friend with an autistic son who once told me, he says, I want to live one day longer than my son. Most parents don't want to bury their kids. But if you have a kid with a disability or that has special needs that you know can't fend for themselves in the world, you don't want to worry about what's going to happen when you're gone. You just don't. And so it kind of shifts things. And so we have several different ways we can look at this servanthood thing. And, you know, if you noticed as you came in, or if you came yesterday, Weeder Hall is filled with all kinds of stuff from your loving servants that you know as the relics around here, who serve in all kinds of ways, doing all kinds of things, from selling cookies to selling treasures and tea, to make money, to give it away. It's all they do. They make money and give it away. It's not a good business model, but it's a great Jesus model. It's the perfect Jesus model, because he said to be a servant. If you want to be great, become least. You know, and when you put others' needs ahead of your own, you're on the right track for what Jesus is trying to get us at. You know, and it's not easy. This world presents a very different picture. I get an email from Maria Shriver. She writes a column on Sundays, and I forget what it's titled, but she wrote a piece this morning, which I thought, this just goes counter to what I'm preaching today, because she was talking about claiming her own power. And that a friend challenged her to, like, be willing to just say what she wanted and needed, and not to, like, I don't know, I think women in our society are sometimes trained to not look too good, you know, and to, I don't know, but her piece about owning her power, and, you know, I thought about, you know, there's women who are in abusive relationships, and men sometimes are in abusive relationships, and I don't think anybody in an abusive relationship should give up their power. I don't mean that. I don't think that's what Jesus means either. But to be a servant, I mean, think of Jesus. What did he do? When the disciples came into the upper room for their Last Supper, he filled up a basin, he took off his cloak, he put a towel around his waist, and he went and washed their feet. I mean, they didn't have big paved roads back then. I mean, there were some paved roads and stone roads, but I mean, imagine it was a pretty dusty place. And foot washing was a necessity to keep your homes clean. You know, I think the modern day version, I get home and I kick off my shoes. You know, but I think in that day, people wore a lot of sandals and their feet were dusty and dirty. And so he did what a servant would do. Got down on his knees and washed his disciples' feet. And what did he say? Remember, you know, do as I've done to you. And that doesn't mean we have to line up and have foot washing all over town. But there are people in need of God's love, in need of service in all kinds of ways. Some are in our families, some are our neighbors, some are in our communities, some may be our coworkers. There are people that don't know the good news, that need the love of God, and there's all kinds of ways that we can reach out to them. We have Soup Kitchen this week, and a number of you know, participate in that every other month. And Food for Greater Elgin, you know, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir in many ways, because I think many of you really do have servant hearts and seek to do good for others. You're on the right track. That's what Jesus wants us to do. And when I think about those experiences when I was working teams that were geared for community building, I mean, they were joyful weekends. You know, maybe sleepless sometimes because you burn the candle at both ends. But it was such a joy to give to others and to see them being drawn into the idea of a loving Christian community. I mean, I grew up in the church, but when I went on a Cursillo weekend, it dawned on me, I was like, this is what God meant for the world to be like. People serving one another, loving one another, putting one another ahead, putting other people ahead of ourselves. That's not the way this world operates. It's kind of dog eat dog, and the one who dies with the most toys wins, and just kind of this one-uppance culture that we live with. Jesus' message is so countercultural. And it's such a beautiful message that in God's kingdom, to be great, we need to be giving. We need to have the heart of a servant. We need to care about others at least as much as we care about ourselves. Remember when Jesus talked to that one guy and he says, well, what's the commandments? And he said, well, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And just like, those are the first two. We had this last week, but then he says, sell everything you have. Everything? Be a servant always? Like I said, I did a stint in I did a lot of respite care after I coordinated the program. I did it for a part-time job and worked with families with kids with disabilities. And those parents are servants all the time. They don't have a choice. If your kid can't stand, can't walk, some of them can't talk, if they can't feed themselves, you really have no choice. Well, you have a choice. I mean, you can put your kid in a facility, and I think at some point that's necessary if they get too big to handle or whatever. But I mean, you're put in this position of servitude. I had one dad once tell me, he said, inside every family with a disability is a normal family just dying to break out. With the same hopes and dreams and feelings, and yet they were put in this position to serve someone else that couldn't do it for themselves. And most of the parents I knew were so gracious about that, and so kind and loving and good, and some of them have been at it 30 plus years. It's not an easy thing. And yet, God sees it. And that they are great. Some of those folks are some of the greatest people I know, and I bet in the kingdom of God will be regarded as such. Because they aren't worried about what kind of car is in their driveway. They're just trying to help a person be the best that they can be. You see these parents that just go out of their way to serve these kids and help them grow to be what God made them to be, even if it's something very different than what a normal kid would be. I don't know what the proper word is. I have some of my old camp kids have kept in touch with me, and they prefer the term disabled. It's like, we got a disability. It doesn't bother them at all to say disabled, but I know through the years that word has changed. And it's not just about people with disabilities. There's so many people walking around in our society with hidden brokenness. If somebody's in a wheelchair, something's broke. People walk around with broken hearts and you never even notice. There are people that need God's love all around us. All we have to do is pay attention. And what if we got that in our hearts, that that's what God was trying to do, to get us to reach out in a world and love? I was looking in my little Heaven Calling book, and this is written in God's voice to us about this passage, and it says, the verse they quoted was, the end of this gospel, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And it says, the heart of a servant, as you get closer to me, you'll discover that my intent is not to lord myself over you. Anyone in authority can force a person to submit. My goal, however, is to win your heart through love. So I sent my Son. He came not to be served, but to serve. Rather than asking people to cater to his every whim, he healed, blessed, and restored broken lives. And ultimately, he laid down his life. He was the suffering servant predicted by the prophet Isaiah, willfully dying on the cross to free you from your sin. I want you to know this love that gives itself away. When you do, it will be reflected in your life as well. And the prayer at the end is, Father, reveal to me your love, which gives itself away. I think that's at the essence of servanthood. It's like, how do we make love tangible in this world? I wish the world could be like a Cursillo community or a Cursillo weekend. I mean, and it wasn't that it was perfect or there was never conflict or anything else, but the undergirding thing was Christian community and love, and people living their lives, using their gifts to serve God and to serve others. It was beautiful. That's the kind of world I want to live in. And what if we left here being fed at this table, receiving these sacraments, taking Jesus in, and we went out into the world and just made a decision to help create that kind of world around us? We have that capacity. It's like that ripple effect. I mean, if you've been watching the stewardship stuff, and I love that imagery of the ripple effect. The good that we put out into the world ripples out and creates goodness all around. It's on us. If that's the kind of world we want to live in, that's the kind of way we have to be. We need to love others at least as much as ourselves and to seek ways to serve them. I don't know who you have in your sphere of influence right now, and I certainly am learning a little bit about servanthood at home with a husband that's in pain constantly. His shoulder is doing great, but he's still having trouble with his back, so that's the next thing we have to address. And he's worried, like, what if this lasts forever? And I'm like, oh, please, God, no. Because I know how chronic back pain can be. And I mean, and I say that in jest, but not really. For him, he's miserable right now. And it would break my heart if they can't figure out a way to fix what's going on with his back. They fixed his shoulder, but now his back needs to be addressed. Each of us has people in our lives that need us. Some have elderly parents, some have kids in need, some have neighbors in need. We don't have to look far to find somebody that needs a little extra love, needs a little extra service. May we be open to be like Jesus, not looking at a way to achieve glory, but looking for a way to serve others, to draw them nearer to God. How might this world be if we all live like that? Amen.